I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. The Senate passed the Honoring Our PACT Act on Thursday. The legislation had wide bipartisan support and will provide health care to veterans exposed to toxic substances. Delaware Senator Tom Carper described the historic moment as doing, quote, right by an entire generation of veterans who have defended our nation over the past 2 decades. Listen in for more.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of the piece of legislation with a very long name, Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson, honoring our promise to address Comprehensive Toxics Act of 2022, also known as the PACT Act, P-A-C-T, PACT Act. This historic legislation will improve and expand access to VA health care for our nation's veterans, including upwards of 3.5 million post 9/11 veterans. It's going to save lives. Let me say that again. It's going to save lives, and hopefully a lot of them. It's going to better ensure that our nation lives up to the promise from President Lincoln's second inaugural address. And you may recall when he said, to care for those who have borne the battle, to care for those who have borne the battle. Mr. President, during his first State of the Union earlier this year, President Biden called on Congress to prioritize taking care of our veterans who were exposed to burn pits and other toxic materials while serving overseas in a number of theaters, Iraq and Afghanistan among them. Today, I'm proud to say that Congress has answered that call, as well as the call of our nation's veteran service organizations, affectionately known as our VSOs. Those VSOs, veterans advocates and military families, many of whom have lost a loved one, have organized and fought for this bill for years. President Biden likes to say all politics is personal. He also says all diplomacy is personal. I think he's right on both accounts. This issue is personal for our president, and it's personal for me as well as it is for thousands, hundreds of thousands of other American families. Major Beau Biden, Delaware's former Attorney General, served in the Delaware National Guard for more than a decade, including a year-long deployment to Iraq on active duty. Mr. President, I was privileged to have served as Commander-in-Chief of the Delaware National Guard for 8 years during my time as governor, and I have enormous respect for the men and women who serve today and have served in the Delaware National Guard. And over the past 2 decades, I've attended countless deployment ceremonies in Newcastle County and Dover as well for our soldiers, airmen, and families, and also assemblies when we welcomed them home, safe and sound. Like many military parents at these send-offs and welcome home ceremonies, the Bidens did not know when their son returned, they didn't know for sure they was going to make it back. When our nation sent him off to Iraq, I believe it was in late 2008. And they did not know, even if their son did make it back, whether he would carry with him the physical or emotional wounds of war that we sometimes can sustain. As it turned out, Beau Biden, a young man I'd known ever since he was a little kid, appeared to make it home back to Delaware, healthy and whole, at the completion of his tour in 2009. I didn't know it at the time, but Beau and his unit spent several months at a place called Camp Victory and Joint Base Balad in the shadows of toxic burn pits that operated for 24 hours a day. Several years later, in 2015, at the age of 46, Beau Biden would pass away after battling an aggressive brain cancer. We couldn't prove it then, and to be fully honest, we can't prove it absolutely today. But the sudden onset of terminal cancer may well have been the result of toxic exposure while he was serving overseas. This story is all too common amongst veterans of the post 9/11 generation, including Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson, for whom this bill is named. A member of the Ohio Army National Guard, Sergeant First Class Robinson was deployed to Kosovo, where he experienced prolonged exposure to burn pits. Now, Mr. President, before I go any further, let me just take a moment to describe what a burn pit is. Burn pits are large areas of land, oftentimes bigger than a football field. They are used to burn a number of things, including trash and other waste products at military installations overseas. The waste is oftentimes soaked in jet fuel and then set ablaze in open-air burn pits, releasing toxins into the air of the surrounding area. Waste burned in these pits includes chemicals, includes paint, includes medical and human waste, includes metal and aluminum cans, plastic, rubber, and munitions, just to name a few of the things. Exposure to the smoke that resulted from these burn pits often caused service members to experience burning of their eyes or throat, as well as difficulty in breathing and rashes too. The toxic smoke could be contaminated with lead, could be contaminated with mercury and irritant gases that could negatively impact an individual's lungs, their liver, and their stomach. As many as 3.5 million service members, including Sergeant First Class Robinson, were exposed to toxic burn pits while serving in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other country. After his service, Sergeant First Class Robinson was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder and stage 4 lung cancer. His oncologist said that the rare stage 4 cancer that he'd been diagnosed with could have only been caused by prolonged toxic exposure. And yet for years, healthy young veterans like Sergeant First Class Robinson have continued to contract rare cancers and diseases. They then come home only to fight a new battle, a battle that involves endless paperwork and claims, all to prove a service connection that almost certainly did exist or does exist. Sergeant First Class Robinson died last year. He left behind a wife, Danielle, and a daughter who at the time was 6 years old. Her name is Brielle. Mr. President, Brielle actually wrote a note to me, not in cursive, but printed. And it looks like it was printed with a camera, or not a camera, with a crayon, rather. And here's what the note essentially said. It says, "Vote yes to my dad's bill," or "Vote yes for my dad's bill." Well, Brielle, if you are at home walking and watching us today, I want you to know that I am going to take your advice. And I have taken your advice. And I hope that one day to meet you and your mom, and thank you for being involved on a very good cause, and for sharing your dad with all of us. Please know that your dad's service was a gift to our country, and that the bill, the piece of legislation that bears your father's name, is going to make a positive difference, not for a few people, not for a few military families, but literally for millions of military families. Mr. President, my own generation of Vietnam veterans had a similar experience to toxic exposures as the post-9/11 generation of veterans. I have been privileged to serve our country in my state in many different roles. There has been no greater privilege than serving the United States Navy and later in the Naval Reserve for a total of 23 years active in reserve duty. After graduating from Ohio State right at the height of the Vietnam War in 1968 on Navy ROTC scholarship, I later would serve 3 tours on active duty in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War as a naval flight officer. My squadron, a unit of the 7th Fleet, flew a wide variety of missions, including low-level surveillance operations off the coast of Vietnam, Cambodia, searching for, among other things, infiltrator trawlers disguised as fishing boats attempting to resupply the Viet Cong in their efforts to overthrow our ally, the government of South Vietnam. Following my time on active duty, I spent another 18 years as a Navy P-3 aircraft mission commander in the Naval Reserve. Barely a month after flying my last P-3 mission in the summer of 1991 and retiring as a Navy captain, I led, at the behest of then-President George Herbert Walker Bush, led a privilege to lead a bipartisan 6-member congressional delegation of Vietnam veterans back to Southeast Asia. Among our 6 members was Congressman Pete Peterson, former Air Force pilot who was shot down over North Vietnam and spent years as a POW in the Hanoi Hilton. He later would become our U.S. ambassador to a united Vietnam. The six of us went to Vietnam because veterans and veteran service organizations were convinced, because they were convinced that hundreds, maybe thousands of our MIAs missing in action from the Vietnam War being held in captivity in that part of the world. We believe that their families deserve to know for sure, with certainty, to have closure in finding out what happened to their loved ones whose bodies were never recovered. Like many of my colleagues, I come from a military family. My family knows what it's like to lose a loved one to war. My mother's youngest brother, my Uncle Bob Robert Kid Patton, died in 1944 at the age of 19 during a kamikaze attack on his aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. My grandmother is a Gold Star mother. My Uncle Bob's body was never recovered or returned home to the country he served. My family never knew what it meant to have really a sense of closure or finality. They never gave up. My grandparents never gave up on him coming home someday. He never did. And so it means something to families like mine for our government to heed that moral obligation and stand up for the military families still waiting to see their son or daughter brought home and brought home safely. It's that moral obligation to our MIAs and their families that led us to travel back to Vietnam in '91, when we brought with us actually and presented to the new leader of United Vietnam, we brought with us a roadmap from President George Herbert Walker Bush to normalize relations with Vietnam. Among other things, the roadmap first called on the Vietnamese, who were meticulous record keepers, to provide access to Vietnam's war museum records as well as its archives, so our investigators might be able to search for clues to help resolve the mysteries of our MIA's disappearance. And with the strong encouragement of our six-member delegation and the tireless efforts in tandem with two members of this body, Senator John McCain and Senator John Kerry, the Vietnamese decided to take this step, and telecommunications were restored between our two countries, and later full diplomatic relations. That same moral obligation that led us to make progress in Vietnam leads us here today. And our moral obligation extends beyond providing closure to the families of the fallen. It extends to the veterans and families who need health care, who are still dealing with the wounds of war, both visible and invisible, long after they leave the battlefield. Mr. President, the same year that we traveled to Vietnam, Congress came together and passed the Agent Orange Act to care for the hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans who were exposed to that toxic herbicide in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. I believe that many of us would agree it took too long, far too long, for that bill to be enacted. But finally, after too many heart and nervous system complications, deadly cancer diagnoses, and even birth defects in the children of Vietnam veterans, Congress did the right thing. The bill before us today also took too long to be enacted. But today, Congress has once again done the right thing. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. President, over the last 2 decades throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, too many of our veterans lived and worked alongside these massive toxic burn pits that I talked about earlier. Hundreds of thousands of square feet of open-air disposal sites where plastics and jet fuel, chemicals, and human waste burned daily, producing toxic black plumes and bringing harmful chemicals into the lungs of unsuspecting service members. Time has come to take care of these veterans, those who have borne the battle. This legislation, the PACT Act, will enhance and expand the VA health care and benefits for toxic exposed veterans. Specifically, this bill will provide VA health care to an estimated 3.5 million post-9/11 veterans who experienced toxic exposures. This bill establishes a presumption of service connection for 23 conditions that are related to toxic exposures, and improves the process by which the VA may add presumption in the future. Additionally, the bill will expand VA research on toxic exposures. It will provide toxic exposure screenings at appointments, and it will provide additional training to VA healthcare workers and benefit personnel. Mr. President, I have spent a considerable amount of time discussing the importance of this bill. Others have been here today before me and earlier this week. I'm proud to have supported it. I know my colleagues feel the same way. Having said that, I also believe that we may have missed an opportunity to consider some amendments that would have improved the bill, and also, importantly, to pay for its considerable price tag. Mr. President, in addition to being a recovering governor, some of my colleagues have different names to describe me. A lot of them call me a recovering governor. I am a recovering governor. I'm also a recovering state treasurer before that. And I have long believed that if something is worth doing, then it's worth paying for. I'll say that again. If things are worth doing, they're worth paying for. And I understand that taking care of our veterans is a cost of war, but these costs should be paid for. That's why I filed an amendment, Mr. President, to have the Department of Defense identify savings to pay for the cost of this bill. I've also filed amendments that address Albert Einstein's definition of insanity. Einstein is famous for saying many things, but one of those is the insanity. He describes insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. What does that mean? It means, in this instance, it means that if service members are repeatedly being exposed to toxic chemicals across new generations, we have to do something on the front end to reduce toxic exposures, instead of always playing catch-up decades later as we're doing now. That's why we should be giving the Department of Defense the tools they need to track toxic exposures more closely, and our service members deserve the ability to report toxic exposures in real time and to be protected from them. I believe these common sense ideas may actually provide long-term savings for the taxpayer and lead to healthier outcomes for our veterans. And finally, while we're not offsetting the cost of this legislation today, it does not mean that we shouldn't provide rigorous oversight of this new funding. That's why I filed another amendment to enhance the requirement that the Secretary of the Veterans Administration provide annual spending plans to Congress, as well as require both the VA Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office to report to Congress on implementation, an important step. My hope is that one or maybe all of these ideas could be included in future legislation later this year, and I look forward to working with our colleagues on improving this important bill as we move forward. Having said that, Mr. President, let me close by just reiterating what I said at the beginning. This is an historic bill for our nation's veterans. It does right by an entire generation of veterans who have defended our nation over the past 2 decades. It's going to bring millions of new veterans into the VA for their health care, including mental health care. These new benefits, which our veterans earn through their service to our nation, are going to make a real difference for our veterans and their families. As the last serving Vietnam veteran now serving in the U.S. Senate, I'm proud to have supported this bill. I want to thank and commend our colleagues who lead the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Senator Tester, Senator Moran, and their staffs and others for working together to shepherd this bipartisan bill through the legislative process. And I want to thank our veteran service organizations, those VSOs that I mentioned earlier, and countless advocates who helped make this legislation possible. And I want to thank the young lady who wrote this note, was kind enough to send it to me, and encouraging me to support this legislation named after her father. With that, Mr. President, we look forward to the President of the United States signing the PACT Act into law very soon. And with that, I yield the floor to my colleague from Ohio.